Donas Douglas. I am stepdaughter to the late Dr. Neville Clare, MA PhD, and daughter of Mrs. Marveline Clare. I am reading from his book and biography, An Oscar for My Troubles, A Life Working for Better Understanding and the Treatment of Sickle Cell Disorder. This is chapter 1, titled 1964 Crisis. I was at home at our new house in Haringey Road. The pain started in my stomach. I thought it was the usual thing and it would pass, but it built up and became unbearable, worse than before. It is hard to describe the pain, something like rheumatism, and in my case, usually focused around my hips and abdomen. The difference this time was the degree. I became helpless in the grip of this agony. Mum and Mr. Stewart only had to look at me to know that it was serious. I don't know why it happened and when it did, April 1964, but I was nearly 18 years old, living with my mother and stepfather, but not for much longer. I was going to college, studying technical drawing, hoping to get an office job, though I'd never heard of a black man getting an office job in this country. Perhaps subconsciously I was doing something wrong. It might have been that I was stressed out without realizing it. It might have been a fairly ordinary infection that triggered it off, or simply that at some point I'd become too breathless for too long, though running about, say. I'd been in pain always. It always had so much of a fact of life as to be accepted and not puzzled over any more by myself or my family. But I never known anything like this. My memory's hazy because of the state I was in. I don't know how long it was before they took me to the doctor. I know they took me. I could barely move my own. We went to our own general practitioner about half a mile away on Whiteman Road, the same road where we'd been living until recently. The doctor took one look at me and said I should be taken to the hospital at once. I'm fairly sure I was taken in a car. I think it was Mr. Stewart's Ford Prefect. I was in too much pain to think about what was going on or going to happen. I don't know what was going through my mum's mind. Again, it was not far. All of these places are just one side or the other of the bustle of green lanes. I was driven back along it and past the end of Haringey Road and along St. Anne's Road, a few hundred yards of St. Anne's Hospital. It is still there, a sprawling lattice of complex of two-storey brick buildings, and the buildings are a bit like barracks, but there are trees and lawns all around, and a park across the road. I got through the doors somehow, and then I was prepared for surgery and given a general anaesthetic, and there, of course, my memory pauses. The Haringey Road property was an ordinary Victorian terraced house, not more than 100 yards from where we'd been living before in Whiteman Road, but that was not the point. Buying the new house was only part of Mr. Stewart's latest project. He had been saying for years, I don't want 40 to catch me in this country. Now his 40th birthday was upon him, and he was ready for it, ready to leave. At the same time as selling the old house and buying the one in Haringey Road, he had negotiated to purchase another property in Jamaica. In a few months he would have everything ready, and then Mr. Stewart would be gone, taking my mum with him. Not me, though. I was nearly 18, and these North London streets, I had decided, were now my home. I have lived most of my life now in the same borough of North London, Haringey. I would not like to give the impression that it is or was a rough area. It was nothing like as poor as where we'd lived in Islington when I first came over from Jamaica to join my mother. It has changed in character over 40 years. Anyone who knows the Green Lanes area of Haringey now will picture the rows of shops and businesses, predominantly Turkish, with every ethnic group represented by its groceries, services and noisy bars and cafes. Back in the early 60s, Green Lanes was, as now, a main shopping street of all the banks and main stores as well, and Woolworths and Marks and Spencers and so on. Then, however, almost every one of the shops was white-owned, and there were a few businesses owned by Greeks or Jewish people, those being long-established communities, but that was it. We did see other West Indians on the street, but they were always consciousness of being in a tiny minority, so if you did see one another, even a stranger, you would wave and say hello, out of a need for a sense of reassurance and solidarity. The thriving Asian businesses of the future were represented only by a few Sikh men who sold goods door to door and out of suitcases. I remember we used to get our West Indian groceries delivered in a box, a big box costing £2, 3 and 6. You couldn't even lift it. It was a lot of money then, and when the average wage for a woman was perhaps £7 or £8 a week, it was the only way of getting those types of foods. Yams, sweet potatoes, green bananas, and so on. But also I think Mum and Mr. Stewart were doing it to support the man who supplied them, because he was another West Indian trying to get by. I was offered the chance to go with my mum and Mr. Stewart to Jamaica. I don't know how sincere Mr. Stewart was about the offer. My mum was certainly anxious about leaving me behind. Since I maintained I was going to stay, she was hoping to organise for me to go and live with a relative to ease her worry, such as her sister Euphemia Blades in Brixton. Though I objected, Brixton was a long way from my college and the area I knew. Plenty of people said to her, "Oh, he's a big boy now. He's 17. You can leave him." But I was her only child, so perhaps always the baby in her eyes. Then there was that phrase I'd grown up hearing, "He's a delicate child." Not a child any more. It was the 60s and this was London. I was going to miss my mum, but I sensed life could get more exciting now. Once there was no Mr. Stewart to vet my friends or to insist I stayed in to make his meals and run his errands. It seemed incredibly that already Mr. Stewart was a smaller, less powerful figure in my life than he had been for years past. A couple of scenes that had occurred since moving to the new house had contributed to that feeling. Just as before, we occupied the ground floor only, and Mr. Stewart was renting out the rest of the rooms. He would need as much money as possible for the project of leaving the country. One day I was with my mum in the living room that would do service as my bedroom at night. A little pile of clothes was stacked up perhaps on the arm of the sofa or on the ironing board as she and I chatted. I remembered she asked me if I'd seen Mr. Stewart or if he had been there. I said yes, and that was all. That was all it took. He must have been standing in the passage listening, unbeknown to us. At once he burst into the room in a blazing temper, picked up my clothes and threw them on the floor. It was unaccountable and irrational, the rage he was in. That was not the unusual part about the scene, though. What makes it memorable is because the thought that went through my head, that it is as far as me and Mr. Stewart goes. He was still going to be there, but in a sense I was done with him already. When he did go to Jamaica and then to Canada, he wrote to me a few times asking me to join them, but I ignored his letters and kept to my resolve. There was no way I was going to live under his roof ever again.